Hi, everyone. Good to see you coming in. We're going to get started in about a minute as folks kind of come together. So feel free to take a sip of coffee or whatever you need to get through the next hour, and we'll start in about a minute. Thanks. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started this afternoon. Good to see everyone here for another Mass Cultural Council workshop. We're super excited to present our webinar today around best practices of leadership transition. For those of you that may not know me, my name is Michael Ibrahim, Program Manager with the Cultural Investment Portfolio here at the Mass Cultural Council. Our focus is grants and services for nonprofit cultural organizations. And so that's why we're excited to present a session on leadership transition. This workshop is part of our Recover, Rebuild, and Renew efforts to help organizations come back from COVID-19. This spring, we've been offering 2 free workshops every week in the areas of financial management, legal issues, human resources, advocacy, management, what we're here to talk about today, and board governance. Joining us today are 2 experts on the topic, Eric Morcheski and Dion Brown from NMBL, I believe that's Nimble Strategies, and they're the ones leading our session today. We'll turn it right over to them in just a second, but a few ground rules as we get going. If you want to say hi in the chat with the name of your organization, just to give a little wave to everybody, we would love that. This session does have automatic captioning. Auto-generated captions are provided on all Mass Cultural Council Zoom meetings and webinars. If you need additional accommodations to ensure your participation for future sessions, just let us know when you register. We're happy to do that. If this is distracting, you can always hide it by clicking hide subtitles in the closed captioning option at the bottom of Zoom. This session is interactive. Feel free to ask questions as we go along using the Q&A function. Eric and Dion are here going to answer questions live in person. You can also be anonymous in the Q&A, and I know leadership transition sometimes is a sensitive topic, and so if you'd rather approach this anonymously, the Q&A option is the best way to go about doing that. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Mass Cultural Council YouTube channel probably tomorrow. We'll download it at the end of today and put it out there. And when that is ready, you will get an email from me with the content that you're going to see today and also the video. So you can share that with folks who may not have been able to attend today's session. Our session is running for an hour. We had it 90 minutes originally, but we know Zoom fatigue is real. So we've cut that down to 60 minutes. Just it's a little easier for everybody. And with that in mind, I'd love to turn it over to Eric and Dion.
Thank you, Michael. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone here about something that I think is really important topic, because I think a lot of times as an organization, we get caught up in the day-to-day and don't necessarily plan ahead for leadership transition. And so when it does happen, it definitely creates a big hiccup in our operations. And so thinking through things, planning ahead, and understanding what that process looks like is a great opportunity for everyone to really embrace what's happening and hopefully celebrate someone moving on to new and exciting opportunities or retiring or whatever it might be. With that said, I will say myself and Dion Brown here from Nimble Strategies, you can go ahead and you can find a little bit about us on our website. It's nmblstrategies.com. And we've actually also created a link that has some downloadable options for you to, a checklist for you to go through a leadership transition that has on there. We'll also load up the videos from some of the experts that we brought in to talk through different pieces of this, and also the presentation. So all of it should be really easily accessible for you. If you just go to nmblstrategies.com/MCC for Mass Cultural Council. little bit about me. I'm Eric Morcheski. Uh, Among things, I've led the largest public-private partnership in National Park Service history, the renovation of the Gateway Arch. We stole a little bit from Boston ourselves when we copied the Big Dig and capped a highway here in St. Louis. I've had the great privilege of speaking to NAFTA, World Urban Parks, and many others on the impacts of museums and green spaces. Prior to my work with the National Park Service as a partner there, I also was the CFO of Gallagher and Associates, one of the largest museum design firms in the world. So it's very likely I've probably worked on a museum or green space near you or that you've been to in the last, well, maybe not in the last year, but prior to that. Dion Brown is here with us today as well. Dion is our managing director of nonprofit services, does an incredible job of leading nonprofits through a variety of things, whether that's strategy, interim leadership, change management that goes on with nonprofits, and has had a great career. After 20 plus years in the Air Force, he also has led the B.B. King Museum, the National Blues Museum, and most recently the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. So really a lot of great projects in there, and also seen a lot of leadership transition in there as well. We came together 2 years ago and set up Nimble Strategies. We really had the great privilege of doing a lot of amazing, incredible things, working on some incredible projects, and we're very fortunate then that we get to see the benefits of it through visitors, through fundraising, through just a global experience, and really getting all of that covered. And so a little bit about us, get into kind of why we're here today. We're here to talk about leadership transition during COVID and really what's changed due to COVID and leadership transition. You're going to hear from some executive recruiters of how they're adopting and adapting their search strategy, the advantages and disadvantages of interim leadership options. And I think this is a really important thing, is when a leader announces they're moving on, do you know what's happening until you find that replacement? And so we're going to kind of talk through each of the steps in there and really identify what your options are, and hopefully help you kind of walk through an internal process to make sure you're making the right choices. And then an improved succession planning practice. And this is another good thing that a lot of times organizations don't take the time to do, but being prepared for that transition is a really good step to be made, and really hopefully your board is embracing that change in it. So planning ahead, let's start at the beginning. Before anyone ever decides they're leaving, what has changed in that planning ahead? We're seeing older executives are prolonging their retirement. What we're seeing is people last March, when COVID really descended upon the United States, we saw a change in philosophy, and older executives who said, I was going to retire in 3 months, are saying, I'm not going to just leave my organization in the lurch. I'm going to stay here through COVID, and then I'll retire 3 months after that. We're seeing executive directors and CEOs giving 9 to 12 months notice, leaving for that same reason. Even if they're not necessarily retiring, they are giving notice enough time so that there's plenty of time that there's no instability within the organization. And that's really creating a great opportunity for organizations to really embrace the change. And real quick, while we're doing this, we've got a few polls to kind of keep people engaged here, just to kind of get an understanding. First poll, who's here, who's listening, so that we make sure, hopefully we're addressing your thoughts and comments and concerns. This first poll is pretty simple and easy. What is your role? And I think it's a good opportunity for us to just get an understanding and make sure we're talking to the right audience. And so we appreciate your thoughts and comments here as we go through this. With that said, we also want to talk about how you're handling transition out when in person, and materials, the knowledge transfer, really hard to do during COVID because nobody's in an office to just hand over a piece of paper. Obviously, we've all found great options like Zoom, like Google Drive, many of these other options for that transfer, but it's never quite the same. One of the other things that's really changed in that planning ahead, the workforce, including leadership, is really expecting a hybrid model today. And I think that's something to really keep in mind through all parts of this process, whether it's planning ahead whether you're in the search or whether someone's just been hired, because a hybrid model has many advantages, but it also has some disadvantages. That knowledge transfer is really that first and foremost. And then you also need to be prepared to address culture questions in a different way, because our cultures have shifted within our organization so dramatically over this last year. And so really, I think it's a good thing um, for everyone to really get an understanding of is how has this changed your culture, and what can you do to make sure you can address that when you're going through a leadership change. Uh, so go. So what decisions need to be made as you're planning ahead? You need to understand the difference between a self-performed search and a recruiter engaged search. There are advantages and disadvantages to both of those. Obviously, a self-performed search a lot of times is less expensive, but it also takes a toll on the people who are performing that search. You need to think about, will you promote from within for an interim role, or will you hire an interim leader from outside? We're going to talk through that process in a little bit here, but it's a good thing to have in mind of whether you have that interim leader on staff or not, or how you'll handle it, because coming to it very quickly because someone has announced they're leaving gives you a very reactive approach to things. And that reactive approach can really create instability, but it also can create discomfort amongst your staff if they don't feel like you really have a plan moving forward. And you're already putting them in an awkward position because they're already experiencing change. And during COVID, any change creates even more instability than during a normal time. If you have a succession plan, is the next in line ready to take that step? Meaning, if you have a deputy director that's that you believe will be your next executive director, are they really ready to take that step, or do they need some classes or training ahead of time to make sure that they're prepared when the time comes? And it's a really good thing to identify early on, because you don't want to put a new executive director or leadership role in a position to fail. And the worst thing you can do is put someone in a role too early, too quickly, without giving them the proper education and training. And so fortunately, one of the great things that's come out of COVID is there are more options than ever for learning and education, and they're all virtual, so you have the opportunity to really experience them no matter where you are, no matter how your office is set up right now. So engaging through some virtual learning can be a great option to really slowly improve things as you go. Obviously, there are some things like donor relations that take just some experience doing. Sitting in front of a donor and asking for $100,000 is maybe never an easy experience, but the more you've done it, obviously, the more comfortable you feel doing that. And so finding what is missing from that person to make sure that they're in a position to succeed, and giving them the tools necessary to succeed, is a great thing really should be part of your succession plan. Concern over the current staff leaving, like I touched on, COVID has really made this an even more unstable environment for your staff as much as anyone. And so we're really seeing that you need to make sure you're heavily over communicating, but over communicating both ways. It cannot be a one-sided discussion of, well, I've told them what's happening. That's not going to work from the board chair's perspective. It's not going to work from an executive director's perspective. That communication, those channels need to be available to go both ways. And then, do you have access and knowledge of all the accounts? This is really a critical thing. It comes up more and more and more as we are separated by COVID. But the fact of the matter is, do you have 2 or 3 people on your bank accounts? Do you have people that are authorized to make changes to your telephone plan at your office, or your office structure if you need to renegotiate a contract? All of these things need to have the right amount of people, and you need to know who those people are and how to get in touch with them to make changes, because you don't want someone leaving and 6 months later finding out you haven't even removed them from bank accounts. I actually can speak from personal experience here. I took over as treasurer of the athletic association at our children's school about a year and a half ago, and went to the bank to add myself to the account. And the president of the athletic association and myself didn't even recognize some of the names that were on the bank account there. Fortunately, nothing had happened that was an issue, but these are things that you should be making the changes for ahead of time as opposed to after the fact. So when you're really trying to create a succession plan, I think there's an internal management option and an external management option, and really think through what's right for your organization. Really remember that both options require an open dialogue with your current executive director. You shouldn't be doing this succession planning process as a board without the input from your staff. And similarly, your staff shouldn't try to do it without the input from the board. I always think a board assessment, a survey of optimal characteristics for the executive director is a really good first step in identifying who or what it is that will make the next step in the organization a step up. And obviously, you don't ever want people to feel like that they're not as good as the next person, but obviously we also, similar to how as parents we feel about our children, you always want that next step in the organization to be even better than the step before. So if you're looking at it from an internal management perspective, succession planning can be really done through two aspects, either through a strategic plan or independent of it. I like the independent step of it just because this is a pretty unique aspect of your organization. And so you may be able to pull information out of people as part of a strategic planning process and a part of interviews that were done with donors and board members. And that's a great feature to have, but running it independently to make sure that it's really addressing this key issue is very important. External management, there are many executive search firms that offer succession planning services. You'll hear from one here shortly. He's actually in the Boston area right now with DHR International that really do this exact focus for you. And I think if it's affordable for your organization, and that's fair to say, it may or may not be, but if it is, it's a really great way to make sure you're going through the succession planning process in the right way. So like I said, we're going to talk through interim decisions. Here's my walkthrough for this. And your executive director announces they're leaving, or you're the executive director and you announce they're leaving. You have a few options, especially right now where we're saying a lot of executive directors are giving 9 or 12 months notice. It's a decision, it's an interim decision to leave that executive director in. And there is a great benefit to that continuity, but it also has this odd feel to it as someone outside applying for it that can maybe be a turnoff depending on how it's viewed. You also don't get that external review of current practices from if you're bringing in some interim person in that meantime. And so it's really an opportunity if your executive director is willing to give you that kind of notice, but there is this downside of there's an opportunity to grow in an interim role, and maybe you've missed out on that opportunity, and it still may be the right decision, but you need to understand that. You can promote from within. A lot of times this comes from a deputy director, a director of development, director of operations, COO type of role. Benefit obviously is that they know the organization and at least one role within the organization. And there's that continuity purpose. Hopefully your staff doesn't feel like they're in a panic because they don't know what's going on or who's there. Hopefully they have a relationship already. They may not be the best option though for a holistic view of your organization. Now, oftentimes, and this is probably the biggest one for me, is if they don't get the permanent role, you see a lot of times where they will leave afterwards. And so if you put someone in as an interim role just out of pure necessity, it has a long-term negative effect if you're not really considering them for the permanent role. It may create some confusion with some donors, especially. And again, any prior bad practices that hopefully an interim person could bring in, are likely to continue. You don't see a lot of change occur within that interim role if you promote from within. Kind of that next step in there, a board member steps in, hopefully that person already has a tie and passion for the organization. They have a knowledge of the operations. We see this occur a fair amount. It can be kind of awkward for staff, right? If they don't have a relationship with the board member you don't know who you're talking to. Are you talking to your coworker who's perhaps your boss, or are you talking to a board member who has a different role within the organization? And will they truly dedicate the time necessary as a board member who's running the organization? Or will they be more passive as they and just check in? And if you have a big enough organization, a passive check-in might be the right approach, but you need to understand that that's what you're getting out of someone if you put a board member in that role. You can bring in an interim executive director from outside. This is something that we do for a number of organizations across the country. We believe that it brings in fresh eyes that can be incredibly helpful in a permanent search. We oftentimes end up helping with that permanent search because we have really kind of gone through the onboarding process very, very recently, and we can in turn use that to make recommendations for improvements, but also have a very candid conversation of what the organization looks and feels like. So it's a really good opportunity to have that open conversation and really make sure you're aligning who your organization is to whoever that next permanent person will be. And the negative, obviously, a lot of times you don't have a tie to your mission, and you have to go through an onboarding process for someone that you're going to lose within 6 months or 12 months from now. And so that is obviously a downside to it. The last option is usually a bad option. Or not, I rarely see this being a good option, but the positive to leaving that space vacant is there's less expense to it. There are all kinds of downsides. There is donor confusion, there is donor concern, there is just the staff questioning their role and responsibility and care. At the end of the day, the buck needs to stop with someone. And you are creating long-term ramifications to your organization by not making decisions and getting down to this leaving a vacant option. Again, if you don't have the money, that may still be your best option, but make it consciously. Don't make it as a result of panic in not planning ahead. So here's a little talk then on the succession planning from James Abruzzo, the Managing Director of Nonprofits for DHR International.
What I'd like to talk about is nonprofit succession planning. And I'll talk about a study that was done a couple of years ago for the Association of Science and Technology Centers. I mentioned that we do work in the arts, but also with science museums, with art museums, etc. And this study is noteworthy not only because of
Not only because I apparently froze the presentation.
very stark results, but also I can tell you that since the early 90s, I've been in the search business since the 80s, I've done a number of these succession plannings studies, and innumerably, each one
well, the video does not seem to want to be our friend right now. So
has almost the same result. If you can see from this study, when I asked that group of CEOs, this was CEOs who I asked, how important is a succession plan? Over 90% of the leaders believe succession planning is of at least somewhat importance. You know, more than 40% said it was very important. And here's the stark difference that over 80% had no plan. So,
So less than 20% said they had a plan. Some said they were not sure. Over 80% said they had no plan. And I would say also that those that said they had a plan, I'm not quite sure if they actually did have a plan. So why? Why are those organizations, and I asked symphony orchestras this at one time, art museums this at another time, I even asked the Association of British Orchestras the same set of questions a number of years ago and got the same results. Well, at least in this last study, which I think is representative, the largest reason, the most popular.
Sorry, it does not like if I try to respond to the chat while this is playing. I apologize.
Reason was the board has not made it a priority. In other words, the CEOs with whom I polled, 60% or more said it wasn't a priority of the board. Yes, some said that the staff is too small to have someone qualified for the position. And I know some of you have that we can't afford to hire someone in that position to be a successor. A few people said they had a successor in mind, but have not told anyone, which I'm not quite sure means they have a succession plan. And then on the other side of that graph, you can see that the organization has other more important priorities right now. Now, that was done a few years ago. I can tell you that based on this study and based on my experience and based on the market, that succession planning and having a sense of what will happen next and having a plan for it is probably the most important thing. And we'll talk about in a few minutes why I think it's so important. Here's a slide. I won't take too much time, lots of words on it, and I will be happy to send you not only this slide, but the other data from the other two studies, if you send me a note. But here are what we at DHR and what I at Abruzzo Associates in addition have put together for steps for creating a succession plan. And believe it or not, it really should start way back, and that the board and the CEO together should prepare for an orderly plan. And I must say that in addition to this, let's call it an orderly succession plan, one should always have an emergency succession plan. You know, the old, what if I get hit by a bus succession plan? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but I suspect that most organizations, in fact, most of our clients, don't have an emergency plan either. And again,
So you kind of
I'd like to talk about.
see here that you're probably not alone if you don't have a succession plan in place. It's really kind of a common practice for people to not have one in place yet. So you shouldn't feel like you're left out in the cold if you have not gone through this process yet. So we're going to transition into the search. Dion Brown is going to take over from here. We're going to launch a poll at the same time of do you have a succession plan in place? But Dion will take over as we launch into the search process.
Thanks, Eric. Welcome everybody for attending this afternoon. Going back to James on the emergency succession plan, fortunately, every institution I've worked at, I've always had an emergency plan. So I would identify over time who I felt on the staff, if possible, who could lead the organization if I was hit by that truck or I dropped off the face of the earth. So at least there would be some continuity for the organization to move forward. And actually, in one instance, the person who I had tapped as to be for succession planning, they eventually became the executive director of the museum, even though they did a search. We'll talk about it later. They did a national search and search from within for qualified candidates. And we'll talk about the pros and cons of that later. But so I understand, as Eric talked about earlier, you got to have some continuity to make sure the checkbooks align, the checking account, the keys, where the bones are hidden, because the organization has to move forward. So in the search process, what's changed? In the past, but with COVID restrictions being removed and changed daily, this may be dated, but initially there were no in-person interviews. And like I said, it's changing now because of the restrictions. And if they were very limited. So we recently had a colleague who they went through the whole process of a nonprofit. It was all virtual, and it took away them getting away from knowing the organization. In prior years, organizations were getting lots of interest in positions, but little to no qualified candidates for leadership roles unless willing to poach from another organization. Speaking on that, we had an individual at one organization that I led. I was hiring a director of development. And when you put that out there in different platforms to hire somebody, you get a ton of applicants, and you had development associates applying to be the director of development, which where you just get inundated, and it takes a lot of time and manpower to weed through those. And what we find now with a client we just worked with, a nonprofit, that we got several very qualified candidates, not just locally, but from all over the country. And I mean, so now you're really having to dig through and do your homework and do your research and trying to find that perfect fit for the organization. Organizations considering interim leadership opportunities until the end of COVID. We saw this happen also. It allows the organization to take a deep breath and establish their permanent target guidelines. Gives them a chance to step back, look and see exactly if they're on pace, see if they're aligned to a strategic plan if they have one, to set the new successor up for the best opportunities. And it's especially valuable for big changes or groups without succession plans. Okay. Decisions. Who from the organization takes the lead in the search? Will it be the board? Will they work with the staff? Will they outsource it? So those are things that identify well on. And how are you approaching the search? Will it be an internal and external? Where to share the job opening? Are there key individuals? Do they need to be interviewed if not going to get the position? Meaning, do you have people on the staff, as Eric touched on earlier, that feel like, as so many people on the staff will feel, that I could do this job, I should be doing this. But do you have to make that decision? Do you talk to more former employees who are still associated with the institution to see if they should be interviewed? And then another key important factor is, how does the staff participate in the interview process? There's pros and cons to both. I've worked one institution where I was interviewed by the staff and their volunteer corps, those that could be there. And I tell you, that was a very interesting interview for the interviewee. It gave me a chance to get to know the staff, some of the volunteers, and put faces to the questions, and plus hear some of their concerns, because when you're talking to the staff during the interview process, you can ask them target questions on how they feel and how things are going. So again, pros and cons, but as Eric was saying, it all comes back to communication. It's up and down the chain of command. We'll talk about it later, but it's that communication piece during the interview process, talking to the staff, stakeholders, volunteers, all. Thanks. So the internal constituents, candidates. Do you have an internal candidate who will be considered or believe they should be considered for the open position? I'd like to touch on this as far as the communication process. Get out in front early so that you don't have an internal candidate, someone on the staff, as I was mentioning earlier, feel like they should be doing it. I know that at one institution, they didn't communicate with a staff member. And I mean, it really caused that person to consider leaving. I was filling in as an interim role, and the board decided not to consider that person. Well, it should have been communication early on versus 3 months into the process. So you got to keep those internal candidates advised to what's going on, and the staff. Continuity. How do you ensure continuity of services while in transition leadership? This is important to clearly communicate with your donors, staff at all times, so they're aware of where you're at in the process and that things will continue to move forward. Under care, while in transition, you can't afford to have your staff feel like they are not cared for. And very important. And that comes from the current ED, if they're still in place, to reassure them that, everything's okay. The board communication, very critical from the board perspective, depending on how that ED, while you're going through the transition. Communication. Solving these issues relies upon constant communication with your team during this process. You must ensure there are open line both ways. I cannot, having experienced so many transitions of senior leadership on my staff or me stepping into another leadership position, it is critical that you continuously communicate with everybody, all community. You know, I even worked with the newspaper to talk to them so that the community was even aware, to cut down on the different opinions that could be going on, be said about the organization, feeling that the organization isn't transparent. And as Eric touched on earlier, donors are watching this at the same time too. Those are your stakeholders that you got to keep abreast of what's going on. So that communication is just imperative, because those staff members, they live in the community and they will be asked what's going on at this nonprofit. And you want to be able to have a positive story being told to the community to keep it moving along. Next slide, please. Now for your external constituents, on your donors, don't let donors, especially major donors, find out information on the street, as I was just saying. I can speak to how I had one of my donors. I had a very great relationship, and as I was searching for a senior level position, I would talk to them and actually have that donor actually do a coffee or a lunch with each one of the candidates just to get their take. I'd give him my opinion, but also I engaged him because he was important. They would be working with this person, so I wanted him to also give me his feedback. We had a great relationship, so there was no expectations, and actually we agreed upon the same person on the selection for that position. Volunteers. Volunteers can lose faith in an organization if they feel like there is no leadership. Ensure your internal team has clear direction to lead volunteers. Very important, because your volunteers are such an important, just like the staff. We communicate with them constantly. Actually, we've even talked to them during this process on if they know of potential candidates. And it's not that you have to select one, but it's just it broadens your reach on people that you may not be aware of. Visitors serve. Don't let leadership transition break your mission. Figure out a way to ensure your mission continues uninterrupted. And that's done by clear communications. When you clearly communicate to your team internally, they will still put off that positive vibe externally, and it'll seem seamless to your everyday visitors. Thank you. Here we go to that key word again within the organization: communication, communication, communication. Anytime there's an interruption to your communications and any link to your staff, your board, it leads to a break in the organization. And that goes into internal constituents and your external constituents. And during this, I will hit on the external constituents. It says if donors perceive, go back one, please. Yeah, sorry. It says if donors perceive instability, they may move their donations elsewhere if volunteers don't know what is going on, or they will share their time elsewhere. And that's what I was speaking of earlier. When you're during this transition, there should be the communications to your donors shouldn't stop between your newsletters, your personal calls. And if the ED is the one that's stepping away, then that's when the board member is going to have to step up. Let them reassure them that everything is moving in a positive, keep them informed on what's going on. And that's how you're going to satisfy those external and internal constituents. Again, going back to communication. Okay. Okay. During your search, there's different options that we all have available now. And as it says about LinkedIn, it's most expensive, but it also is the best for a senior position. Idealist, okay, Indeed is good, but Eric can speak to that of what kind of the leads you get off of that. Partner with different groups, just like MCC. Go to different organizations and say, hey, we're hiring people. Do you have any suggestions? I've partnered with countless other nonprofit organizations, not to poach from them, but to get us on their job boards. There's local organizations that will advertise for you. It costs you some, but it's targeted, just like with the nonprofit association. You can advertise there. Museums have AAM, AAAM, different areas that you can put your intent to hire somebody. The biggest one, well, not the biggest one, is announce it through your own social media. I mean, those are the people who have a love for you and appreciate the work you do. Do it through your newsletter, your Facebook. And last but not least, by no means, talk to your major donors. They're connected to the community, they're engaged. They may have someone in a particular leadership position that may recommend. Again, be careful with that though, because some major donors will automatically expect you to hire that individual. With that said, we're going to go to a video from Sarah Kruger, who's the founder of OTO Search, and let her speak to us.
Hello and greetings from St. Louis, Missouri. I am Sarah Kruger. I am the founder and lead search consultant here at OTO Search and Recruitment. I've spent 20 years in the search world and staffing world, and I've worked with a number of nonprofit organizations who have been experiencing critical leadership transitions like yourself. I've partnered with them on a pre-search basis as well as assisted their board-appointed search committees throughout the actual search and recruitment process for their next ED, CEO, or president position. I can sympathize. Leadership transitions are no doubt tough. They're tough on every individual within your organization and at every level. We need to consider it a journey, and you're at the very beginning of that journey, and I'm here to share the good news that this is a journey you can prepare for. Some might think it's simply about the actual recruitment process, but I would encourage you to do some significant preparation before you jump in. In order to navigate a successful leadership transition, we're going to need to spin a few plates and keep them spinning all at the same time in order to get this one right. Add in COVID, which has created an immense amount of uncertainty for ourselves, our families, and our workplaces over the last couple of years. And a leadership transition at first glance seems to offer no more than the same. But it doesn't have to be that way. There are ways to prevent and prepare and foster a sense of comfort as your organization moves through this transition. I will say COVID has intensified the need for best practices, for thorough preparation, for robust communication, for planning, and quite honestly, a genuine and authentic connection with every individual in your organization. Taking no one or no thing for granted as you move through your transition is something to keep top of mind. So when I think about the pre-search phase, which comes before the actual recruitment process, I think about how we can raise the odds of a great hire. This preparation is about doing just that, raising the odds of not just a great hire, but also a stellar onboarding process for your individual. And in order to do that, we must be well aligned as an organization, and we must come prepared with a compelling story so that candidates will love and embrace our organization, our mission, and want to join us for that journey. That's what we call an employee value proposition. Why should someone come and join and lead your organization? We want to be doing exactly what our new leader would want us to be doing at this time in their absence. So when you think about your preparation in that sense, there's 3 plates that I mentioned we need to spin all at once ideally. And those 3 plates are taking care of our internal stakeholders, taking care, leveraging, caring for our external stakeholders, think board, donors, strategic partners, and also paying attention to the organization itself. Oftentimes, this last step is overlooked, and it's really important. The organization has its own identity and its own needs at this time. We want to essentially move closer to the stakeholders on these 3 spinning plates as we move forward. So a few tips before we move on into your journey. Initially, I would recommend appointing 2 key leaders, ideally ahead of your transition team and the head of your search committee. Quite frankly, you could use coaches co-chairs, but more than likely your head of your transition process is going to be your board chair. It should be someone who has exceptional communication skills and a high level of EQ. Emotional intelligence will be critical as you move through this journey. When thinking about external stakeholders, don't forget about your donors and your strategic partners. Those relationships need to be built and fostered and nurtured, not just at the executive director level, but on throughout the organization, so that when your ED leaves, those relationships don't go with him or her. From an internal perspective, we want to talk about that communication plan, and that's exactly what your transition leader should be tasked with. How will the news roll out that your current leader is leaving? Who will hear first? Who will hear second? How will external parties be notified? What does the role for your departing executive director, or perhaps you went with an interim executive director, what does that role look like? Let's manage the expectations and set some guideposts in terms of what those roles look like in this interim phase. We also want to take stock of internal talent. There may, for all we know, be a rock star in the wings who could take the helm of your organization and lead it successfully into the future. But more importantly, we want to take a look at individuals who could be what I call transition champions for your organization. These are individuals who would serve as a source of comfort and or information for other employees during the transition process. And this is a tool that your transition leader can utilize and leverage as they move through the process. Lastly, we want to think about the organization itself. I mentioned this is most oftentimes overlooked. Obviously, institutional knowledge is a paramount need to secure, and there might be a lot of that institutional knowledge walking out the door with your departing leader. So what can you do? What processes, procedures, techniques could you put into place to capture some of that departing knowledge? Most importantly, your board should spend some time thinking about where you've been as an organization, where you are now, and where you would like to go. And therein lies the secret to your recruiting success. In order to take your organization to its next level, we need to identify what the criteria are in order to get there. Is it a fundraising challenge? Is it a program challenge? You would know better than I, but those are the types of things you need to identify objectively. What is it going to take to get our organization from its current level forward? And that will help shape the criteria for your new hire. Of course, this process ideally takes 6 to 12 months, but you may or may not have it. You can expedite these steps in any order. Just don't skip any steps. As mentioned, COVID has intensified the need for good planning and great communication. We want to appear to our external candidates as well-organized organizations with passionate employees who are working towards a compelling mission. We want to invite them into our world and understand what it could be to lead our organization into the future. With that, I wish you all the luck in your transition ahead. It can and should be a great journey. You are building the next chapter for your organization, and I wish you well.
So with that, we're going to go into onboarding and Dion.
All right, so what's changed? So one of the things that's changed is there's no in-person onboarding, and it's causing a lack of personal interaction, with other staff members. And what has happened, a recent colleague of ours just started, and a lot of this is based off of some of their experiences on it. And so they couldn't get to meet the staff, and prior they met through phone calls. Well, it's not that personal interaction. Same way with donors and board members. They didn't get to meet their board chair in person until 2 weeks after starting the job for several reasons, but still, you don't have that connectivity as you did pre-COVID. Smaller organizations are seeing an increased learning curve as individuals have to find things on their own, because with COVID, everybody's working from home, small organization, and so you have to go in and figure out where the keys to the office are, the codes to the alarm. It's a plethora of things that with these smaller organizations they have to deal with. And all this leads to a slowdown onboarding process, and it causes stress already for an ED coming into an organization to have to learn all this. And you will get the feeling that it's unorganized. When it is, you just have to pre-COVID, everything was more continuity. So this is things that we're learning, and hopefully people are coming up with these checklists that Eric mentioned earlier. And I believe it's also on our Nimble website. Things to think about to be prepared for onboarding. Okay. The next slide, some of the decisions. Some organizations, and it has its pros and cons, is do you get an interim? Eric talked about it earlier. Do you have an interim leader come in internally or externally? And what can the interim leader accomplish that will allow permanent hire to be successful? One organization that Nimble Strategies worked with, we went in as a interim executive director, and I worked primarily with the staff, but more focused on the board to help them set up, identify the type of candidate that they needed, and then what lead the search and what would be the best fit, while at the same time, administratively, we were lining up the administrative side with the checking account, with the telephone, email, so that way when it transitioned and we hired a new executive director, they could hit the ground running. And I like to say we were successful at that whole process, because that executive director actually that called me or emailed me and thanked me for setting things up for them. Then another question comes is, should the interim leader remain engaged for a period of time while a new ED gets up to speed? That can depend on the length of time. That need to be a clear understanding. One of my positions, I had the interim executive director stayed on for 90 days. Well, after about 3 weeks, he saw that I was competent, and he wasn't engaged enough. He was like, I'm stuck here for another 60 days and I really don't have anything to do because you're doing it. But I needed him because he had that corporate knowledge that it would have took me too long. It was nice to have him 2 doors away that I could say, hey, blah, blah, and we could get to we could keep the organization moving. But so you have to understand your organization and how long you need that interim, if you decide to do an interim leader, what that term is after the new ED starts up. One of the things that you should be looking at during this time is, should you build a new succession plan or strategic plan, business plan? Those are the people, we have another seminar we do later at other times that we talk about strategic plans and how important they are to move your organization forward. Lastly, does the staffing fit to support the new ED? That's a decision you have to make. Luckily, as an interim, I never had to go in and actually do a restructure. We may have moved titles and shrunk some of the skills that they had to do, duties they had to perform, but we didn't have to get rid of people. That should be that ED position. Next slide.
So, what's changed in new employee expectations? I think really from that standpoint of onboarding, flexibility is a really key. We touched on it a little earlier, but McKinsey and Company found 52% of workers would prefer a hybrid setup in a post-COVID world, up from 30% prior to COVID. But what was more striking is 30% of employees said they are likely to switch jobs if forced to return to a fully on-site setup. So if you know this about your organization, as you're bringing someone on, you need to understand what their interests are and what their needs are in that flexibility, but also how you're going to address them, because you may be in an organization that hybrid is not an option because your guests are coming on site and you need to be able to serve them with a face that is present at all times. But you need to have the messaging and the understanding and the ability to address that with new leadership coming on. A connectivity to the culture, contradictory to that work from home mantra. The Achievers Workforce Institute survey found 46% of employees feel less connected to their companies. And that's probably not a huge surprise. It's harder to connect to people when it's virtually. It's just not quite the same as being in person and having those water cooler conversations, having those just pass-bys in the hallways, and just that real human interaction. The trust factor is that third point. 44% of respondents to that survey said they logged into work earlier and or stayed online later because they worried that their manager doubted their productivity while working remotely. And I think we've all seen it where, you kind of wake up in the morning and you're like, well, I might as well get on and start working. And, you're working away and all of a sudden you're like, oh, it's 7 o'clock at night. I had no idea. All of that raises the risk of burnout within your organization. And so it's something to really keep in mind is you need to build that trust factor with your staff and vice versa. And then the other alternative to that, though, that hybrid environment can raise the risk of resentment between in-office groups and work from home groups. If you don't have a uniform policy, it can really create an environment that people just don't feel like they're being treated equally, and that resentment only will grow over time. So building that trust factor becomes incredibly critical right now, probably more so than ever. With that, Jackie Dace, Executive Director of St. Louis Artworks, is going to talk here a little bit about living through this onboarding process. She came on to St. Louis Artworks about 2 months ago and has been in this role now for a little bit. We did this interview of her actually through Zoom, so you'll probably see me twice on here.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jacqueline Dace. I'm the Executive Director here at St. Louis Artworks in St. Louis, Missouri. And I started here March 29th, 2021. So my process is still relatively new. And as we're talking about onboarding for an executive director, it's been quite interesting, and especially interesting since we're coming out of COVID. Our executive director that had been here for 25 years, she retired in August of 2020. So there was a period of time that the institution went without having anybody in the leadership capacity for the institution. We do have a contract team that's been working with the staff. However, the onboarding process was relatively different. Currently, the staffing of St. Louis Artworks consists of myself, a full-time office manager, a part-time program manager, and an art therapist that is also part-time, and she was hired shortly before I came on staff. Our art therapist specifically works with our students and with the apprentices that we hire. So in terms of the actual workload, that workload falls on the shoulders of the executive director, the program manager, and the office manager. COVID, of course, everything that we've come in contact with, we do via Zoom, and I'm pretty much zoomed out. When you're working in a nonprofit organization, there is a lot of personalization that makes a big difference in terms of making contacts. I have not necessarily even met all of my board members aside from meeting them on a on in person. Aside from, I think I met 5 of them. We had a sale on Saturday, and I was able to meet some of the board members there. So it makes a big difference when you are working with people and you're not being able to do it on a personalized basis. When I came on board, the office manager had a file folder of the insurance documents, everything that I needed to sign, all of the requirements. And that was basically our onboarding, what did the, what were our hours? What were the programs that we were holding? But there are some other issues that I've discovered and that I'm still discovering. And there's no one here to walk me through, primarily in terms of the history of this place. This institution is 26 years old. So as you can imagine, there's 26 years worth of programs. There are 26 years worth of fundraising. There are 26 years worth of development that has gone on that needs to be located and found, and there's no real structure. So what I've been doing in one of the areas that I'm most concerned about is putting that foundation in place. Putting a foundation in place so that if anything happens to me within the next couple of months, I'm not saying that I'm leaving, but we never know. We've just gone through a pandemic. What might happen? That the next person that walks in the door will not have to reinvent the wheel, that they'll have this structure in place. I think when we hear the word onboarding, we hear the word onboarding from a corporate structure, from a for-profit structure. And that's a totally different animal than when you're working in a small nonprofit organization. Just trying to find the documents that are necessary to find out what the history is of working within one of our organizations, or with someone that has donated to St. Louis Art Works. Takes a couple of hours sometimes. So it's to me, I'm losing time and exerting a lot of energy in just finding the information. So a process that should take 5 minutes to work through, and then I can send an email out to discover where we're going to go from here, might take a couple of hours of research time. A few conversations with individuals to find out who that right person is that I need to talk to before I find out the process. So when we talk about onboarding for a nonprofit that has had a somewhat of a shaky foundation, right now I keep saying that we are on, I walked in and there's like some quicksand. The quicksand is getting a little bit firmer. We're building. I can feel like I can stand on it a little bit better now. I'm understanding it a little bit better now. But I want this quicksand to turn into some real concrete, so the next person that come in is standing on some firm ground. And that's what I think is a requirement when you are working in a nonprofit, working in any type of an institution, that you need to leave your legacy for the next person to come on, so that it's an easier path and an easier ride. Because when we're developing these programs, my interest are in the apprentices that we're hiring, and the information that we can give to them, the education that we can impart upon them, and the experiences in which they can gain from working with St. Louis Art Works. My interest is not necessarily, or shouldn't be, focused primarily on trying to restructure and reformat the institution, because that's where I'm spending too much of my energy and too much of my time. But in the same vein, it's progress. I'm seeing progress. Progress is going from not being able to understand where to find a document in 2 hours, and now I can find it in 45 minutes. Yahoo! That's success. That's success. But what I think the important thing that I want to share to people is that you're not alone. You're not alone in this. It may seem as if you are doing this all by yourself. But as I've told my staff members, we have a huge elephant that we have here. And it's important that we understand that if we're going to eat this elephant, we're not going to eat it in one big gulp. We have to take one bite at a time. And that's what we're doing right now. We're taking small bites, and we're going to make a big dent out of this elephant. And so I see progress happening. We had a wonderful sale just the last Saturday. We had great energy. Our students, they participated and they learned a lot. And that in itself is what I find is important. So we're moving forward, and St. Louis Art Works is going to be on a firmer foundation by the end of 2021. And if I'm here in 2022, or if another executive director is here, trust and believe it's going to be a different experience.
So, when we recorded that, I didn't realize that I was going to be in that video as well. So sorry you had to look at two of me. We'll wrap this up real quickly here. Real quick, current landscape of nonprofits in the U.S. A little over 900,000 registered nonprofits. 92% have a budget less than $1 million. So, we talk about trying to make people feel like they're not alone when they're going through these processes. And those nonprofits are primarily community-based, local focused. We all hear about the American Red Cross or these major national, international organizations, but those are the exception, not the rule. And that's important to remember, is that you're not alone, that 50% of nonprofits have 3 months of cash on hand right now, 10% have 1 month. And during this last year, there have been lost sales events and fundraisers, and that all really factors in, even in a leadership transition, how you look at and how you assess what you're doing there. And so with that said, I'll leave you with, this is Dion and I's contact information. You can also find a few free resources down at the bottom of this screen. nimblestrategies.com/MCC has a checklist for you as you go through that quick leadership transition process to start to prepare for it. It will also have all the videos from our 3 guests on here, as well as the presentation. The other thing that we like to offer, so we have a free strategic planning prep kit that really does tie in well to this as you start to think through the future of your organization. Completely free to download, just another option that you have out there to really start to make assessments of your organization. We really appreciate you being here. One of the things that I do want to reiterate is, as a part of this, we offered the opportunity to speak with us individually about your specific organizations. And so feel free to reach out to Dion or I, and we'll be happy to set up a call directly with you at a time that's convenient. So thank you so much from Dion and I. And I think Michael's going to close us out here if I remember correctly. Otherwise, I will welcome you all to have a great day.
Great. Thank you so much, Dion and Eric. I won't take up any time. We're a little past. So I just want to say thank you to the both of you for giving us some resources and information today. And thank you for everybody else for attending our session. Take advantage of Eric and Dion's offer to meet with you afterwards if it's something that you would like to talk about or talk through your specific situation. I highly encourage to do that. Otherwise, stay safe, and we'll see you at the next Mass Cultural Council webinar. Thanks.